Well, now we start our first panel discussion after this very, very informative and insightful conversation we had with Dennis O'Brien. Now we have the pleasure of having the first panel. I have to confess one thing, that I hope it doesn't stay in this room. For years that I've been involved with the International Telecommunications Union, for many years that I've been involved with the GSM Association, speaking at conferences, moderating, and with the mHealth Alliance and the rest, we've always tried to balance the members of the panel in terms of the gender, making sure that we have enough men and enough women on the panel. I'm delighted to see that the female part of this panel is overpowering the male side that is as a bookend sitting on the two sides. It's a great pleasure to have you all. The conversation that we like to start again is something that I alluded to at the very beginning, the infrastructure that Dennis also talked about. It is not only the hardware infrastructure, it is not only the broadband infrastructure, it is not only ICT by itself, but there is another infrastructure that is somehow very closely interrelated. That is the socioeconomic infrastructure that needs to be put in place, and Dennis again talked about it very clearly about Haiti and Africa and other parts of the world, that how these things have to work together. Each and every one of you have done many work from their own organizations and from the size that you have contributed. Instead of reading your bios and reading something about the organizations, first of all, I'd like to introduce the panel members who are joining us today, in case we did not get a chance to do the introduction with each and one of you. Pippa Biggs is the senior analyst and economist at the International Telecommunications Union. And again, instead of reading the bios, you can just go on the website and making sure everybody has the information. I just want to make sure I don't miss anybody's correct title and the work that we wanted to share with you. Tom Arnold's on the other side, the Chief Executive Director of the IIEA. Lauren Woodman, CEO of NetHope, and Samara Hammond, the head of AMREF in London. So again, read this description and work that they have done in the many, many years of illustrious life without taking our time for introduction. So people, I'm going to start with you. Just tell us about some of the challenges that you believe we are facing. I'm just going to go down all the way to see what are the things that we need to do, and a little bit about, if you want to talk about the role that ITU plays.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Clearly, it's a tough act to follow Dennis O'Brien, who has first-hand experience of doing what some of us merely analyze and talk about from a distance. But it's definitely that there's a range of challenges involved. A little bit about ITU. ITU, in line with its mission to connect the world, we work with member states and industry to allocate the radio spectrum globally and develop standards. So some of you may have heard of DSL suite of standards or our GPON fiber optics. And we also work to enhance the policy and regulatory environment. In terms of the challenges you were asking about, you mentioned a big word, transformational, and that is indeed part of the challenge. Business models are being broken up and smashed at an alarming rate. We're really seeing a massive shift in terms of power from governments to individual multinational corporations. Actually, that's an old label, but certainly the business models that have been used to connect the current 1.9 billion people online simply aren't going to work for the next 2 to 3 billion. So you have the problem of the last mile, obviously, that may or may not be the last meters in developed economies. In developing economies, it's not a last mile problem, it's a last 200 mile problem. So how to connect rural, remote areas, and also with what speed, with what services, and how to pay for all of that, given that the old business models no longer work, really.
Samara, you're running an NGO, and you also wanted to make sure, again, the resources that you're looking for are coming from different parts of the community, the private sector and public sector. Share with us to see what are the challenges that you're facing. I should go on. Yes.
Is it on?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Reza. For those of you who don't know it, I am working for AMREF Health Africa. It is Africa's largest health NGO. And when I spoke to Reza before this conference, and we sort of talked about what are your infrastructure challenges, not just the ICT ones. They're large, they're huge. The communities that AMREF Health Africa works with are the hardest to reach. So vis-a-vis, the infrastructure is also the weakest there. I'm going to paint a little picture for you, which I hope will illustrate some of the challenges we have. One of the communities we work with, about 3 hours outside Nairobi, called Mwingi, very rural community. Electricity doesn't really go beyond the town, so if you have electricity, it's reliant on solar panels, if you can afford them. Health clinics are there, but they're quite disparate. People might need to walk 10, 20 kilometers to receive health services. ICT, mobile networks, yes, they're there, but they are patchy. In other parts of Kenya, they're not there. We've been working on a program recently with Accenture and Safaricom, looking at how can we train community health workers using a mobile phone. And some of the research that we did at the beginning of the program showed us that actually a lot of them had mobile phones, but not the smartphones that you and I all have, and I suspect are attached to and panic when we lose them. They're the simple mobiles, they're the Nokias that we had 10, 15, 20 years ago. And one of the things we've been able to develop is a way to train community health workers using the simplest of technologies. So you've managed to we've talked about leapfrog, and I listened to Dennis O'Brien. In fact, I probably could have listened all day from what he was saying. He's so knowledgeable and absolutely on the money as well. And for me, one of the absolute core tenets is working with the governments. And you don't often hear people say it quite so boldly and so loudly. But in reality, if you want things to last, if you want things to be sustainable, they have to be bought into and owned. So thank you, Reza.
Thank you, Samara. I'm going to ask Lauren to share some the work that NetHope has done, and some of the projects, again, without divulging any confidentiality. I know you're working with some of the organizers and universities back with my great friend, Dr. Bob Bollinger's organization at Johns Hopkins and the rest. Please share with us to see where you're going and what are the challenges that you're facing.
Thank you, and I appreciate the time to be here this morning. So NetHope is an interesting collaboration of 42 international development NGOs and the technology industry. It's about a decade old, and we came together to look at how some of the challenges around connectivity and ICT in the development space could be bridged by trying to institutionalize at some level a public-private partnership with the commitment to work together. I think, a lot of the challenges that our member organizations face are the ones that you've heard here today and are quite familiar to everyone here. We've started to try and address those in a number of different ways with different new technologies that are emerging, some of them actually in rural Kenya, looking at places where things like TV white spaces might be utilized to provide better connectivity. There are certainly a number of emerging technologies that we've looked at around how do we expand broadband connectivity around the world in partnership with the private sector. And I think one of the things that we've certainly learned over the last couple of years in working with our member organizations is that to your point exactly, Samara, the challenges are not just those in technology, but actually how do we look at the entire ecosystem and pull in the local communities that we're working with, the community health workers, beneficiaries that now have access to technology, and pull all of that together in a way that actually can address some of the myriad issues that our organizations are trying to speak to. I do think that emerging technologies have a huge promise, but like anything else, need to be tested and evaluated before we put too much faith in them. And so part of that work that we've tried to do over the last couple of years is really think about what are the critical success factors in looking at emerging technologies as before we go out and deploy them too broadly, and hope that we can pull too much for them.
Great, thanks, Laura. And, Tom, your organization based in Dublin, but you're reaching out to many countries and organizations all over the world, as Dennis also referred to. Share with us to see what you're doing and what are the challenges that you're facing.
Well, just to be clear, I stepped down from being Chief Executive of Concern nearly 2 years ago.
Yes.
But happily there are a number of Concern people here in the audience, and I'm sure we'll be able to talk about it. But I mean, I would reflect a little bit on some of the developments that Concern has been engaged in over the last the last decade.
Okay.
And I just pinpoint 3 words which I think are very appropriate to set off this conference. One is the emphasis on an ecosystem, the fact that we have to look, there's no point in looking at bits and pieces of things. Things have to fit together. Secondly, what Dennis said at the end of his contribution, long term. You have to think long term, you have to think about collaboration with governments, because there are no short-term fixes to these problems. And last week in the Financial Times, Larry Summers, the famous economist, in talking about some of the lessons to be learned from the Ebola crisis, said this proves that unless the world invests in health systems and significantly in poorer countries, the risk of things like this happening and having a massive impact are going to increase. And the third point that Dennis was making is very relevant. It's the whole issue of partnerships. How do you develop effective partnerships? There are preconditions for partnerships working, of course, and that is trust and its capacity and, if you like, mutual respect between the different partners. But they are, I think, among the things that I think Concern was really focusing on, over the past decade, and I'm sure is relevant. If I could maybe conclude, because one of the other things I've engaged in at the moment is perhaps a very interesting example of this, and it is not maybe so well known. About 4 years ago, something called the Scaling Up Nutrition movement was started. This was really a collaboration between governments, the private sector, civil society, the donor community, etc., to see what could be done to really make an impact on undernutrition. And over the past 4 years, this has grown fairly remarkably. And there are now 54 countries who are signed up to Scaling Up Nutrition. And a couple of months ago, I was asked to be the interim coordinator of SUN, while David Navarro is off dealing with the Ebola crisis. But we are having next week in Rome a meeting, a global gathering of a lot of the people engaged in SUN across these 54 countries. And that's going to be followed by the International Conference on Nutrition, which again is a very significant conference, which the last time it was held was in 1992. And all that represents is, I think, the really greater focus that has been and has developed on nutrition over the past number of years. But the key conclusion from a lot of the work that's been done under the sun is that, again, it requires commitment by governments, leadership by governments, effective partnerships, and they are the preconditions, and you can then begin to start impacting on the rates of stunting and on the levels of child mortality.
Thank you very much, Tom. The conversation that our panel members started, from people all the way to Samara and Lauren and Tom, they're getting into the areas that is not only the technology is going to have the solution, but there are other things attached to the technology. If you can give them the smartphone to every single community health worker in Africa, if you put every single child in front of one of those laptops or one of those iPads, they still need to get food. They still need to get clean water. They still need to get shelter. They need to still have access to healthcare and the rest before they utilize the technology in such a way that we believe from the Western world, so to speak. Every time that they go to their house after their school, they still have to look for some place to turn on the light somewhere. energy still is a big issue. Again, shortage of the energy, electricity, again, of course, a big problem. Before I start my second round of questions and interaction with our panel members, I'd like to invite each and every one of you, be prepared, ask questions and contribute and participate. As Dr. Bob Bollinger, my good friend, told you at the very beginning, we want to have this interaction. And people who are receiving our streaming video on their websites or different parts of the world, if they want to ask questions, if they want to send us tweets, they're more than welcome to do so. But if we don't ask question, we are going to come to you and ask you question for you to be able to participate. Especially those of you who are representing different governments in different parts of the world, we would very much like to hear from you to see again what your reaction is, because we talk about effective partnerships, we're talking about critical success factors that I'm going to come back to you and ask you to share some of them with us. There's a lot going on between the private sector, public sector, academia, NGOs, and governments. So all those pieces, there are a lot of moving parts that they all have to be put together towards the same goal that we are all committed to, that we are all creating incentives, that we all benefit and we all value. And at the end of the day, as again my good friend Dr. Bollinger says, it has to be sustainable. You cannot just do it on a 1 and 2 basis. You cannot just do pilots. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 pilots now going on in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. It might be more, it might be less, but somewhere in that name. And anytime that you talk about the pilot, yes, we had this resource coming to us from a pilot. We created this, and we don't have enough resources to go beyond the pilot. Or many pilots that come and go and nobody talks about it. I personally would like to change the name pilot into first phase. Instead of calling it pilot, when you get the resource, call them this is the first phase. Because when you tell them it's the first phase, then you have the second phase coming up. And even the donors organizations and donors from the private sector or even public sector would tell you, if you did the first phase and it's successful and you delivered what was expected, then we can go to the second phase and scale it up to third and fourth and the rest. So that's the thought, again, to leave it with you. But please be prepared to contribute and ask questions or make comments. People, I'm going to come to you. Many of our conversation involves data. Everybody's talking about big data. Our profession, the profession of healthcare, is all based on data and evidence-based and outcome. How can we capture the data? Again, everybody's talking about big data. Coming to us and being able to utilize the data throughout the process that we can claim success coming out of the initiative.
As an economist and statistician, the value of data depends hugely on what you actually want to use it for, because the question you ask entirely shapes your answer, and also how you treat that data. Certainly with regards to not to really focus on the Ebola crisis, because ultimately that's just one virus out there and by no means the most dangerous or even the most widespread. But people were asking what's really the sort of use of ICTs for Ebola. And obviously there's a role for information and awareness raising and spread, and people in this room know more, way more about that from their practical experience. In terms of data and big data analysis, obviously you have the studies whereby you should may be able to pick up the outbreak of epidemics before they happen due to online searches, etc. And Google are probably the best people to ask about that. Then you have this role of the mobile phones, obviously, and tracking technologies. Very controversial, but could be very helpful, not just in the developing country context, but also in the developed, in terms of if you have volunteer health workers who have volunteered to work with a highly contagious patient, rather than trying to go back to see which cruises or which planes they took, where they've been over the past 21 days in the recollection of somebody who may already be pretty ill or their acquaintances. If once they volunteered to serve, they then had the tracking application of the nature that suspicious wives may put on their husband, I do not speak from experience here, then that whole evidence as to where somebody has been and whom they've interacted with could be done, presented to you on a plate, and then checked and verified. You'd have a tremendous head start in a very time-pressured situation. That's fine where somebody has volunteered to put themselves in that situation and accepts knowingly to have such tracking technology. Is it fine where the government, the operator, or Google decides for a population to start tracking? Arguably, one of the problems that made this particular outbreak very difficult to deal with is that it happened in a border area, and when people realized it was Ebola, according to the WHO website, they fled fairly quickly into the surrounding countries. So straight away, WHO was dealing with three countries, three different governments, three different ministries, three different health systems, rather than one. So that would appear to be a major factor in why the response to this particular crisis was perhaps less effective and efficient, and how it made it into urban areas. But these are all moot points. Certainly what ICTs do raise is the possibility of using ICTs in very new and innovative ways, but there are a lot of questions, particularly the confidentiality, privacy surrounding that.
So Mara, you also deal with a lot of data, again, being such a big organization and having such a widespread activities and initiatives throughout Africa. How would you deal with the collection of data and the trustworthiness of it and validity and being able to use the data for creating solutions?
Oh my goodness, $1 million question.
Okay.
I think working in very remote or challenging areas, which is where AMREF Health Africa tends to work, collection of data can be challenging. So we are constantly looking at new and innovative ways of doing that. And it's not necessarily down to technology. In a lot of our, in the clinics that we work in, broadly speaking across East Africa, you will find on the outside of the clinic a whiteboard where data is collected on a monthly basis. It's very simple, it's very cheap, it's very effective way of collecting and tabulating data. That data then is fed up to the county level. The project I mentioned initially, using simple mobile phones, we're looking at ways that we can collect data at a community level using those. That I know that there are other mobile solutions out there using smartphones collecting data. I think one of the challenges at the moment, and being a public health specialist by background, data is only as good as the person who's put it in. So one of the core tenets of any sort of data is the quality of it. So for me, part of that journey or part of that value chain, or however you want to describe it, is ensuring that the quality of data that's being collected is good. Because otherwise the questions you are answering won't be accurate.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, I'm going to ask Lauren, because she's dealing with 42 different NGOs, and they all have their own visions, goals, and missions, although you've created the umbrella of bringing everybody under the same roof. But it sounds like you have a lot of diverse ways of collecting the data and also being able to achieve their goals based on the data. So.
That's true. I mean, I think, certainly I think data has become a very hot topic both in the technology world and in the NGO world in terms of how do we think about opening up data, sharing data, and devising better interventions. And certainly there is no shortage of data out there. I mean, I forget what the number is, but I think there's 277,000 tweets per second, or 73 hours of YouTube video per second, so that we as human beings have no shortage of capacity to create data. We are challenged with how to use data effectively, and then how to share data so that we can figure out across organizations what the data is really telling us. I mean, your point is exactly correct. The questions that we ask and the way that we share that is important. I think there's a couple of things that we need to look at as organizations and practitioners in the space. The first I would say is that there needs to be a very open conversation about what data do we share.
Sure.
And certainly I think there is a tendency to try and keep data somewhat safe and secure. And I don't mean that from a privacy and a security perspective, but in terms of proprietariness. But there's a certain level of data that if we share our ability to design better interventions and to learn from one another makes a tremendous amount of sense. 30,000 pilots is too many pilots for us to be learning anything from. The donor community has come up with the phrase called pilotitis, to characterize the number of pilots that we have running that we're not actually learning from. And so we need to be, as a community, we need to be, thinking about how we can work together to share both outcomes and best practices, as well as data that we can leverage from one to another. Our organizations have started to work together around something known as the Open Humanitarian Initiative to actually look at data that is particularly relevant in times of emergency response. And that effort is nascent and it's growing, but it's a recognition of saying in certain scenarios, sharing data becomes critically important to design the right kind of interventions. And so how do we actually start that work and make sure that that data is available to the organizations broadly so that we can work most effectively?
Good. Thanks, Lauren. Tom, I'm going to come to you now, especially with the most recent project that you're involved, the initiatives that you're leading with 54 different countries, and I'm sure with 50 different, four different cultures and languages and ways of doing things. How you see the collection of data and the distribution and sharing of the data to help you to be able to achieve the goals that you have set up for this initiative?
Well, part of the whole potential of this Sun movement and the fact that 54 countries are now involved in it is the capacity to learn from each other.
Yes.
And one of the core ways of doing that has been the establishment of what's been called communities of practice.
Yes.
So it's where countries on a particular topic have something to learn from each other, they actually share it. And we're facilitating that. And one of the documents that has been recently produced in April of this year is a booklet which is on the Sun website called Information Systems for Nutrition. Okay. And this has a series of case studies, and one of them, very interestingly, is about Rwanda, which was referred to earlier on, and it talks about a system where rapid SMS is being used to continuously track the pregnancy cycle from until the child is born 9 months later. But the system works using real-time community-based information and linking in with trained community health workers. So again, it really emphasizes the point that data on its own is of no value. Right. It's how it connects and is able to inform actions and policy in the wider ecosystem. And but I think data increasingly, if you have those health systems in place, then the potential to use data to achieve positive health results becomes obviously very, very important.
Great, thanks. Any questions or comments from the floor? Just remember, I'm going to ask you to participate, and yes, please go ahead. But just a second, the microphone is coming. Please say your name and the organization, and then.
Hello, my name is Manoj Chavla. I'm here in a private capacity, so I was curious about why you feel that 30,000 pilots are wrong. Now, I take a slightly different view. I actually think pilots are good, and it doesn't matter if there's wasted effort, because at the other extreme is centralize everything, and soon you're heading towards communism. With all the lack of motivation and all. I'm not here on a political agenda. But entrepreneurship, by its very nature, and experimentation carries risks and wastage. But that is part of the human thing. Otherwise, Christopher Columbus would never have set off because there would be a risk of failure, right? So failure and knowledge being lost are part of the consequence of the human condition. And to sit down and want to centralize and coordinate it, to me, is very the antithesis. Otherwise, why would we all bother to be here? We just need one head office, send everything to there, and then get a reply back that it's a good idea, and we'd all be wasting our time coming here.
Well, that's a great, wonderful question. Remember, we are not against the human beings in pursuit of finding the truth or in pursuit of creation of the new ventures or new territories and entrepreneurship. Absolutely, I'm a serial entrepreneur personally myself as well too. It is the way that we treat pilots, and I'd like to ask again the panel members to respond to it, but that's the result and the impact that we anticipate from the pilot, as opposed to having the pilot to be an end to itself. If it opens up the door to many things, again, as you said, to extend, either it's a bad idea, we drop it and we go to something else, or we create something that is going to be sustainable and
Can I
sure.
just add 2
Please.
points?
Sure.
The nature of innovation is never the result that you expected. I mean, today we're talking about the telephone, and I'll point 2 very interesting
Yes.
things that we should all go back to. I worked in telecoms a long, long time,
Sure.
okay? And the first thing is when Alexander Graham Bell invented the phone, and he was asked what he thought it would be used for, his answer was to pipe music from concert halls to people's houses.
That's right.
Right? And we've only come to doing that now. All right?
I'm very much in favor of the unintended consequences of the
Unintended
innovation.
consequences.
Absolutely, yes.
And the second point that I would make is even the way that sometimes things aren't always rational. Like if we were still working with manual operators connecting phone calls, and God forbid internet connection being done manually rather than with routers, you know, we'd employ the whole population of this planet. But the reality was that the Strowger exchange was created, or so history goes, because an undertaker was finding all his calls being diverted to somebody else every time the phone came through an operator. They had bribed the operator. And he set about, not with the view of getting rid of telephone operators and all of that. So I actually think that to try something will create some other results, and you never know. And I can bet you when Steve Jobs started thinking of the iPhone, the applications that have come to mind were never in his wildest imagination.
That's right. Lauren, please go ahead.
Sure. Don't misunderstand me. I spent 25 years in the technology industry before I joined NetHope. I am a firm believer in experimentation and innovation. I think the difference is that we as a community, and this is true in the technology industry as well, but when you're talking about scarce resources against some very significant problems, we need to get better. And frankly, with technology, we have the capacity to get better at sharing the results of the pilots that we have and building on top of those. There's no problem with 30,000 pilots. There ought to be 45,000 pilots or 100,000 pilots. If those pilots are actually testing things that are progressive and we're actually building upon one another. What happens in the innovation space is we learn to fail quickly. We don't fail quickly in development, right? We fail over 5-year projects or 7-year projects. And then by that point in time, we've started 3 or 4 more projects that are essentially the very same thing that we did somewhere else, except we used a different size smartphone or a different size tablet. That's not going to move us forward. The other thing that happens in the technology space that doesn't happen necessarily elsewhere is that once those failures happen or there are advancements, they make their way to the commons and people build on top of them. Unfortunately, in too many other sectors where we don't see rapid development, we don't fail quickly, and we don't learn from one another. And that's where I think the approach that we've taken to pilots, we need collectively to start talking with one another about what did you learn? What did I learn? How would I have done that differently? And publishing those results quite broadly and making it okay to fail. It's so dangerous sometimes for organizations that are trying to do the right thing to stand up and say, we tried this thing and it did not work. Or it worked great here and it didn't work there. And we can learn from that so that the next pilot and the next pilot, the next 30,000 and the next 100,000 are actually building on top of that learning. And then I think we actually get to see the real impact of what we could do in technology and leveraging technology and the tools that we have available today against the problems that we all believe need to be solved. So please don't misunderstand. I'm a firm believer in innovation. I'm a firm believer in trying things. My concern is that when we try those things, we're not sharing our failures and we're not building on top of one another, which is where the real progress I think is going to come.
Hipa, you want to make a comment?
Yes, I think big data could indeed help with your analysis of your 30,000 or 35,000 to establish what your true criteria for success are, although you may not always know why or how they arise. But the more data you're recording about each experiment or pilot, then the better informed you'll become about what will help facilitate success. What I'm seeing here is social media, blogs, etc. They enable you to take data off the ground and to learn much more about each pilot. But so, this is really sort of turning culture on its head. We're learning to learn from the grassroots rather than the top-down diktat from the ministry about what does or doesn't work. So you're definitely moving from top-down models, which you often see in government, to bottom-up models coming from the development space. So there's a bit of a cultural thing there. But of course, with social media, I'm actually finding it much harder to distinguish the signals from the noise. You're getting absolutely overwhelmed by irrelevant comment in some cases, and it's getting very, very tricky to sort of spot the really pertinent facts. So that is where education comes in helping you to sift through and distinguish what's relevant from not. I am a bit worried about the culture shock, PPPs you're talking about, I'm sure next.
Tom?
Well, no, I mean, I don't. I think nobody would dispute the importance of commitment to innovation, etc. But there is also the question at times of the reinvention of wheels, and I think that perhaps if we had better sharing of successes and failures, then I think people could set about framing pilots with a better knowledge of what they're about and maybe a better chance of succeeding.
So, people? I'm sorry, wait, Samra?
I'm actually going to pose a question rather than answer.
Oh, okay. Now you're on the spot.
How do we do it better together? I mean, I absolutely support everything my panelists have said. Innovation is essential. Pilots are essential. Wood for trees, I've heard over here. How do we work together? And that's to everyone in the room, not just you, so that we can see the trees, so that we can decide which ones of the 30,000 or 40,000 we're going to choose to build on. Because at the moment, what I see is a competitive community with everyone hiding their pilots. If it doesn't work, you don't hear about it. If it does work and you're a big organisation, you will hear about it. If you're a small grassroots organisation in Turkana in northern Kenya, you probably will never hear about it. So how do we get to a place where we can work more collaboratively together so that we're all building on what works?
I can only speak from my limited experience. Generally, I find that if I go and talk to enough people, and I'm not afraid to discuss my idea, then you will actually learn a lot more. And a lot of the issues are actually not, the technical community is very open about sharing. If you have a problem on the internet and you put it out, you'd be surprised, half the learning, if you're ever a developer, is actually by going to blogs and so on. So I think creating the confidence within people, the academic culture has a very set thing about giving due credit. And I think that's very important for a lot of people, that you have that respect, that people's ideas aren't plagiarized and so on. And I think the signal to noise issue that you talked about, first of all, the trouble is there's too many people. I tend to take more Professor Telford's model about asking generalists rather than experts. And the problem with the social media is everybody who's good at it knows how to hijack it. It's about, in the old days we used to talk about the squeaky door gets the oil, right? So I think part of the issue is really about creating the right culture and credit. And what I normally do, I find, if you knock on enough doors, that's how I've ended up here. Thank you, Tom. So giving credit where it's due. I had an idea, I rang around to test whether it was the only idea. Tom said, come here and find out more. And this is where forums like that make that possible.
Absolutely. So great. Alan, you got a question? Oh, I'm sorry, great question back there. Please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Hoon Sang Lee, and I'm health advisor in KOICA, the Korea International Cooperation Agency. Actually, it is a shame that I was not able to be in Korea during the ITU meeting, and I was really glad that some of the discussion was taking place about needs for utilizing ICT for Ebola. I have two questions. Actually, one is about partnerships. Actually, 2 weeks ago, I was in Ghana. I'm working on developing possible partnership between KOICA and USAID with Samsung's contributions to work on partnership activities for mobile health. But one of the difficulties I had been seeing was it seemed like even the Ministry of Health was one of the stakeholders. So it seemed like Ministry of Health was having very hard time leading all these efforts to put everything together and to have a more comprehensive framework of approaching mHealth. They were just explaining about bits and pieces of a lot of different pilots and initiatives. And actually they, Ghana MOH has their own actually initiative they care. So they, it seems to be becoming one of the stakeholders. So my question is, who will bring these things all together? I mean, who actually has the leverage to do that? And who is actually the respected body, not just on another NGO or WHO, but maybe WHO can be one, but who can be the final respected body? Maybe that can be mHealth or other the partnership. But that was one of my questions. And my second question is, how about talking the needs for discussing about in-country context for basic ICT capacity? Because sometimes, even though we introduce a lot of great mHealth program and mHealth pilot, sometimes in some countries they have very great ICT human resource like Bangladesh. Even in Rwanda, actually we are working on working with UNICEF to do the national scale up of rapid SMS. And what was really wonderful about what it was, there was a Rwandan startup company who was actually supporting doing the technological support. But in other countries, sometimes that kind of in-country capacity, ICT capacity is not existing. So maybe we need more fundamental consideration about what will be the basic enabling environment, ICT capacity, technological capacity environment, and maybe this can be a great opportunity for job creation within the country. Not having other European or American company to do all these jobs, but having all these people in the country to develop their own skill sets and to develop their own industry, and that will also help the economy as well. So I was wondering what the panelist is having about that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much like our first participants asking those very important and good questions. Thank you for those questions. I'd like to ask the panel members to respond both at the same time with the questions, or if you want to take one question at a time. Tom, we start with you this time.
Well, I think this really highlights something that is absolutely of fundamental importance, that if we are to get improvement in health outcomes, it has to be based on sensible policy, and that requires a certain level of basic capacity at governmental level, policy capacity, and then, if you like, administrative capacity. And then you move on from there to looking at your basic health infrastructure at country level. And there is no way around the fact that this needs long-term commitment and long-term resources. And, you know, people sometimes talk disparagingly about the role of government. Well, when you don't have an effective government, that is probably the most fundamental blockage to the possibility of long-term development. And it does go back to Larry Summers' point that I quoted in his article in the FT recently, that if the world is to look at the health as, if you like, a global risk over the coming decades, how can we, as a global community, try to ensure that our health risks are diminished? We have to invest in health systems. And that goes right back to empowering and resourcing the World Health Organization, but in particular, it has to go to the country level, where countries, there has to be a commitment by the leaders of countries themselves, but then to have these systems, but then supported by the international community.
Thank you, Thomas. A very, very important question, just to keep in mind again, if anybody else wants to make a comment or reaction. Tom mentioned the effectiveness of a government, the being an effective government. I would like to also add the transparency is also part of the same effectiveness. You cannot separate an effective, transparent organization from the organization who's not effective, and a piece of ineffectiveness comes from because they're not transparent, because they're not sharing what they need to do. Lauren, when we come to you.
I want to speak to your point about the ICT capacity in given countries, because that's a challenge for many countries. And certainly the two that you highlighted, Bangladesh and Rwanda, are places that have very good in-country ICT support. Certainly something that NetHope has been doing over the last couple of years is actually training young adults in ICT, largely to help our member organizations that are working in respective countries have the capacity that they need to meet their own ICT needs. But that's highlighted for us this ongoing need to provide technical training to youth around the world. One, that's not something that our organization does, but there are lots of organizations that are doing that out there, both in the public, both from a public sector perspective and from a private sector perspective. And I don't think you can underestimate the importance of doing that. I mean, certainly the needs for that are going to grow over time, and bringing that capacity into any economy will be a spur to help build those types of capacities, not just in health, but in education and in government and many other places where those skills are needed. So I would simply agree with you that that's a real area where we need to provide some focus. And I would further agree with you and take that a little bit further, that bringing those skills into an economy, especially with youth, does spur innovation and creation and new opportunities that we have not yet imagined that come out of these countries around the world. Some of the most interesting innovations that have happened over the last 4 or 5 years have certainly come out of countries where you would not necessarily look first for innovation. But as we heard earlier this morning, mother is the necessity of invention. And so when there are opportunities and there are scarce resources, the things that we see coming out of many of these countries are really quite fascinating. And I think we'll see that continue to accelerate if we can provide kids the right skills that they need in order to help support those innovations in the future.
Great. Samara?
I'm going to pick up on the point about partnership, because I believe that you can never achieve true sustainability or scale without partnership. And I'm not defining that partnership in any particular way other than a group of people. So it could be a public-private, it could be an NGO and a government, it could be all of the above. Who should lead? Who should broker those partners? I think that possibly is a longer discussion. In my experience, it's the person who stands up and leads and coordinates it and makes it happen. Things only happen when people turn up and make them happen. So you need someone or an organization, but typically it's down to individuals to make that happen. And sustainability happens with engagement. You need to engage the local communities, and then broaden that out to the country. And to get that engagement, there has to be government involvement. And from a health perspective, that's the Ministry of Health.
Yes, in defence of governments, ministers, I would like to point out that the expectations are absolutely enormous. Not only are they expected to get to grips with the public health issues, and clearly, as we saw this morning with His Excellency Minister Loinda, it helps to be a doctor there, but also I had recently attended a workshop at the WHO, and the ministers there are having installed brand new shiny telediagnosis units in their hospitals, were busy trying to get to grips with network traffic management, sometimes known as net neutrality in the States, buffering, latency, and most of all bill shock, basically. So so there was this sort of crossover from the ministers of health who suddenly were now expected to become IT experts. I would also like to draw attention to the very fine judgments required for long-term investments in long-term assets such as networks, public health systems, and then these short-term crisis situations, which frequently get more publicity coverage, all of which has to be in sync with the election cycle. Ministers are having to allocate their budgets very carefully, and now the problem with putting the market in charge is that you put the bean counters in charge as well. And as we are now seeing, global public health is a public good, and the market may not always factor that in. And how to struggle is still something that people are struggling with. So it's all very, when I live in the Alps and looking around me, there's a huge infrastructure there from the turn of the century for the tuberculosis. There are amazing hospitals, sanatoriums that were put in place because the accountants weren't in charge, so they weren't worrying about lazy assets sitting there doing nothing, because people understood that if you had infectious people, you had to get them out of the public, the broad population for the public health good until they were cured or worse. And that just wouldn't be possible nowadays because the accountants will not permit assets to be sitting idle. Well, they may be sitting idle for this year, but maybe next year they are at full capacity and much more is needed. So if you set aside a small proportion of your budget each year to cope with that capacity situation, actually in retrospect, even the bean counters might be satisfied that you've justified that investment. But of course you can't see that in foresight. It's difficult to see that it has to be done in hindsight or as a precaution investment, which may not always be popular with your electorate.
Thank you. I hope some of these comments were satisfactory. The piece that I would like to add to the comments that you heard in terms of partnership is also the leadership. The leadership does not just come with the name and recognition and all the glory that goes with it. Leadership comes with responsibility. So whoever is that organization who accepts that responsibility of leadership, they have to deliver. They have to be participating. And of course, the main ingredient of partnership to be successful is the commitment from all sides concerned. I think Alan has a question. Wanted to ask you a question? Please go ahead.
Sure. I think it's all.
Is it on?
So I'd just like to congratulate everyone on really highlighting this issue of government engagement. I'm Alan Lebrique with Johns Hopkins Global mHealth Initiative, and we've been advising mHealth projects around the world. And if there's one thing we've learned is showing up at a Ministry of Health with a preformed innovation is possibly the least likely thing to succeed when you want to partner with the government. In response to what Hung San was asking about, I think there is a tool that PMNCH released earlier this year called the Country Level Readiness Toolkit for ICT. And I think that's a really useful toolkit that about 100 different experts in the field, some of you may also have been involved in that, to look at country level readiness for ICT innovation. I think it's a useful thing. But when we come to thinking about pilotitis, I think some of the blame lies with the donor community and the way in which limited funding allows us to only construct things to demonstrate feasibility, but not necessarily to scale. And when you try to push something that's been built with matchsticks to hold up an entire health system, you're asking for the unreasonable. So the solution to this, I think, is challenging. In academia or in public health innovation, we're asked to perform due diligence before a donor contributes funding to that space, right? We're asked to show what else is known in nutrition, what else is known in early newborn support systems and so on. But in this space, we often aren't forced to go through that due diligence. So part of the work that we've been trying to do, and I think that there's a broad community around this, is building sort of a common language and framework so that when you talk about mHealth innovation and I talk about it, we're using the same language so that we can actually identify where there's overlap and where there is potential wheel reinvention. And I think that's really critical to accelerate. So we do use this common language across the space. And WHO this year has released a site called mRegistry, which I think is a first step to getting innovators across the space, from small NGOs in rural Kenya to large NGOs like some of you on the stage, to register projects so that we do have that transparency. But I'd like to propose that we also need build to standards beyond just semantic interoperability standards, because you think about aircraft. If you're going to design and build an airplane, it better have certain core components that allow you to land at any airport around the world. In the same way, we need to have these sort of build to standards, and ITU and other normative agencies have the opportunity to provide that as we move from the era of pilotitis into an era of maybe more convergent enterprise-grade solutions. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. Any other question? Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Trip Allport from Accenture. I wanted to respond earlier to the question of how to do it better, and I'm often known for provoking a little bit, so I'll try to not offend everyone in the room. But Elena, to your point, I think the donors play a big role here, and we had a workshop in London a couple months back and got all the donors together, and I will suggest that some of the things that are happening around building standards, building common sort of rules of the road, and we can see some interesting shifts with like the likes of the Global Fund with their Innovation Coalition and others. But for all of us who are engaging with donors and multilaterals, to continue to encourage them to help us connect each other. Because honestly, I think my second point, us as implementers or those of us out there, somebody's already working on your problem, is I guess my view of it is, you know, innovation is not always good. I do agree that innovation is important and entrepreneurship is important, but it's not always good. And if somebody's already working on it, could we not contribute our efforts, our resources to what's already out there? Could we not start to build on common platforms? There's fantastic things that are going on out there, and if it meets 70% of your requirements, chip in your effort to make the other 30 as opposed to starting over again. So it comes back to this point about partnerships, but the need to collaborate. And again, we've been doing quite a bit of that. I'll be up there tomorrow, and we'll be provoking on that point as well. You know, it gets to, in our sector, nobody likes to talk about it, but the ego and the competition. We want our own programs, we want our brands on the page, but if we can start to put that to the side and collaborate, you know, I think a lot of this in 5 years, hopefully less, maybe 10, you know, we'll be talking about something altogether different. So there's some really encouraging signs, but I think it takes not only the donors and the governments, because we often point to them, but it takes us as well to look at ourselves and say, do I really need to build something new? Or should I ask around, probe in my network, find somebody else's tool, and maybe add a little bit to it?
Any other question, comment? Okay, I'm going to start with you, Samara. Start responding to points that Alan brought up and other comments, and make your own concluding remarks as well, because I'm realizing that we are towards the end of our session. Please.
Thank you. Just building on what Trip said just now from Accenture, I was fortunate enough to attend the workshop in London at the end of July. I believe several of the people in the room were here. I believe strongly that partnerships, and I said this a minute ago, are our way to scale and sustainability, working together, building on our innovation together, making mistakes together. There was, I hesitate to say this because I believe there's another Africa song about to come out, but there was a song in America done for Africa several years ago, and Quincy Jones, I believe, was the producer, and one of the things he said was, everyone needs, and the likes of Michael Jackson, etc. there, everyone needs to leave their egos outside the room. And I believe we need to get to a stage where we do that as well. We don't worry if our logo's on the page. What we worry about is what we achieve and the impact we get at the end of it. Thank you.
Great. Lauren?
So I couldn't agree with you more that partnerships are critically important. And certainly I think the work that we've seen happen inside NetHope over the last decade has really been a celebration of that type of partnership. It's not easy and it doesn't always work. and we learn things and we try and build on those. And I think that that's continuing to push in that partnership direction becomes critically important, and especially continuing to push on those members of the private sector, including the technology companies, that are really eager to try and figure out how they can help support this work in partnership with the work that many of the NGOs and ministries and multinational organizations are doing around the world is also critically important if we're going to see success. I do think that that is an ecosystem if we're going to move forward, and so that includes the donors as well. And I also think especially as we look forward and we think about mHealth and it really landing in the communities in which we serve, that also means including beneficiaries, many of whom are now technology enabled or have access to technology. And so I was thrilled to see some of the sessions over the next couple of days think about how do we actually involve communities leveraging technology as well. So looking at that ecosystem approach and figuring out how we move things forward through partnership is really, I think, the best promise that we have to making some real success.
Right. And I will put you in touch with the relevant people. We do work remotely. It doesn't mean weeks in Geneva at a time. Quite the reverse. You can make your contribution, and we're very democratic. As Reza knows, it's not possible for it not to be taken into account. There may be, Wade, but we would love to work with more of you to make sure that our standards really are the best they can possibly be.
Tom?
Well, I just think we should really focus on the potential there is over the next 10 to 15 years to really make substantial change. It's taken about 30 years to get child mortality from 20 million a year back to about 7 million. That should be further reduced. We have the science, we have the technology. We need now to get this big leap forward to invest in systems. And really, with clear targets. And this is where the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, this is where the global community can set its targets next September for dealing with health, dealing with poverty, and dealing with hunger.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Well, this brings us to the end of this session. I thank you very much for joining us, for participants who ask questions or comments or even challenge the panel to think and look at the different parts of this very, very complex issue. As we talked about, again, the ecosystem is not a solution to all our problems. What the ecosystem is a mechanism, is a process that we all can agree upon, that what the ecosystem can be, who are the players, what are the incentives, what are the outcomes, what are the deliverables, what are our roles, what are our responsibilities. And of course, one of the main ingredients of the ecosystem is collaborative innovation that can be also one of the outcomes of this process. On your behalf, I'd like to thank each and every member of the panel who participated and shared their thoughts and ideas with you. And on their behalf, I'd like to thank you for joining us and participating in this session. Thank you. Thank you very much.